But I'm very aware that music is a form of revelation to the world, not just to believers, but that in their own way, non-believers and the skeptical in general are having their souls opened up by an art form which I think opens a window or a door onto the very nature of God itself. Perhaps it's music itself that is, rather than words or the usual understanding of what evangelization is. Maybe music itself is part of that reconversion of the world to an understanding of the love of God.
So welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name is Piero Finaldi. I'm the CEO and publisher of the CTS. And it's my very great honour to welcome to the podcast Sir James MacMillan, one of the country's foremost composers and a fellow Catholic, and somebody who speaks with great eloquence on the way that the music intersects with faith, and not just, you haven't just spoken about it, you've lived it and communicated it to all of us. So welcome. So welcome, Sir James. I wanted to start the kind of really with some sort of basic questions. So tell us a little bit about your musical upbringing. Where did the kind of musical bug kind of really bite?
Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm from Ayrshire originally, and I moved back there quite recently. And so my musical life began there. It began in the little Catholic school that I went to, St. John's. But important figures in my musical development were people like my grandfather, who was a coal miner. But like many coal miners, had played in colliery bands. The brass band tradition is very strong in industrial areas in the United Kingdom, and it was certainly the case in Ayrshire. And it was he who got me my first cornet and took me to my first band practices and so on. So he was a very important figure, both musically and in life's journey. You know, he was a very devout man, and he sang in his local church choir as well. And I remember his house and my mother's house was full of music that he had sung in choir, that he had made my mum play. My mum was a very reluctant pianist, a teenage pianist, but I found sonatas by Beethoven in the house, and which she had obviously played, music by Chopin and so on. I started to try and pick out the melodies of this kind of music in my own way.
What age would that have been?
Well, I started quite late, actually. I was about 8 or 9 when I started, but I became very enthusiastic. It was like a light going on. There was a bag of little wooden recorders brought in, plastic recorders actually, brought into the primary school and handed around. And it's not the seismic moment it is for most British school children that it was for me, but it certainly felt as if a light went on. And then that's when I wanted to be a musician, but simultaneously I knew I wanted to create music. And the nuns who taught me back home in Ayrshire knew immediately that they had someone who had some kind of keyboard facility, so I was pressed into service, playing for little school liturgies and school masses and so on.
So what did music in the home look like?
My grandfather was reluctant to play his hand as a musician, as was my mother, but they encouraged me. They brought a piano into the house. They encouraged my trumpet cornet playing. I was a young trumpeter for a while. So any musical event was celebrated in the home. They were keen to get me teachers. I was very lucky in the teachers I had. My trumpet teacher was the principal teacher of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, principal trumpeter of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra. So in Scotland, you couldn't get much better than that. And that infused me with a desire to pursue music in as many different ways as possible.
So I'm always interested about this question with composers who will often kind of start off with a particular instrument. So would you consider yourself a kind of trumpeter, or you did?
Yeah.
And how does that affect then the way that you compose?
Well, I always like to keep my brass sections busy in my music. They always notice that and comment at rehearsals that you've given us a lot to do today. But I know what brass is capable of. It's not just the big sound, which can be exhilarating, but there's an immense depth and sensitivity possible from the brass section. I especially got that from the brass band world, because the cornets and all those instruments that are used in the brass band, the tenor horns and the baritones and flugelhorns, they actually have a smaller bore than the orchestral brass, so that their sound is actually much more delicate. And so as soon as you put mutes in, you're entering into a very ethereal and beautiful and serene territory indeed. And I tried to recreate that in some of the brass music I include in my orchestral scores.
I mean, what's the sort of health of the kind of brass band world? Because it's it had its real moment in the sun with that famous movie that came out in it was in the 90s, I think. How are things going as far as you know in sort of brass band world when most of the collieries are not there anymore?
Oh, that's right. That's been a major problem for the brass band tradition. However, they've bounced back and reinvented themselves. And brass teaching, brass playing in state schools is actually very strong. And it means that the demographic involved in classical music and the orchestral world in the United Kingdom is very interesting, because one of the problems that we have in the teaching of music is that, as many of us know, it's beginning to disappear from a lot of state schools. The big difference to that is the teaching of brass. And I don't know why that is. In working class areas all over the United Kingdom, brass playing is actually very, very strong. And to the extent that a lot of brass players in the British orchestras are from that tradition, that they were trained to a very high level as brass band players. And demographically, in class terms, they are different from their colleagues in the woodwind and string section, which were basically kids who went to private schools. And it's an issue that many educators are anxious about, that high standards of music making are beginning to disappear from the state system. And what do you do? Well, there might be a lesson there from what the brass world is doing. Perhaps we should be looking to how the brass world, and indeed the brass band world, has maintained those standards in demographics that you sometimes don't expect to be involved in classical music.
Great. So they were the easy questions. Let's get into something a bit more controversial. So, I mean, you grew up, I would say, in a moment where religious music, and I think especially Catholic religious music, was in a moment of crisis. Would you kind of agree with that in the sort of 70s and 80s, or 60s, 70s, 80s?
I wouldn't use the crisis word, but I'm a product of my time. I became a young Catholic when this generally quite unexpected convulsion happened in the church, and we're still living through that. I mean, both musically, liturgically, theologically, ecclesiastically, the Second Vatican Council had this huge impact. The repercussions of which will not be known fully for perhaps centuries. So in a sense, both ecclesially, theologically and liturgically, and indeed musically, we're at a very early stage. Now, I know where your question's coming from. There's a lot of debate, controversy, if you like, about the nature of Catholic congregational musical style, let's put it that way. And the attitudes that have sometimes arisen within the church regarding tradition, musical tradition, liturgical tradition. And some of those attitudes can be a bit extreme. The kind of ditch everything, throw the baby out with the bathwater approach was not helpful. Perhaps a more nuanced understanding of tradition and what tradition means in theological and musical and liturgical terms might be the better way forward, so that we're not turning our backs on the necessary simplicities that are required in congregational music, but perhaps there's a debate still to be had about style and aesthetic. There's a very particular kind of American congregational style that has infiltrated the whole English-speaking the Catholic Anglosphere, if you like, which is dominated by an American populism in congregational music that has taken hold. And perhaps that's one way of doing it, but it shouldn't be the only way of doing it. There are other ways of doing prayerful, simple congregational music, and that debate is current, and it's a vital debate to be had, and that many different kind of musicians can bring their own perspectives to the table, and perhaps I was able to do that too at some stage in my life as a composer.
Yeah, because with my sort of Italian background, I looking at the way that liturgical music went, for example, in Italy, where all of a sudden in the 60s, everybody was looking for something to sing as a congregation, and there just wasn't that kind of choral or hymn singing tradition that, in fact, we did have to sort of fall back on in the Anglosphere. I'd be interested to know what was your sort of experience of music in church kind of growing up? Were there any pieces that you kind of look back on with particular affection, or that had an effect on you?
Well, my experience of Catholic life, Catholic liturgical life, Catholic musical life was in a very small parish in Ayrshire. And so it was what amateurs brought to the table, and therefore that experience was very typical of many parishes throughout this country and throughout the world. And good people who are committed to bringing whatever skills they have to help the church are to be encouraged, amateur and professional. And perhaps there was an atmosphere in the 60s and 70s that we had to facilitate whatever was possible for those amateurs to be able to bring about successfully. And you're right, the church was starting afresh. It wasn't just in Italy. There were many aspects of the international church where we had to ask the question for the first time, what on earth are we going to sing? How are we going to sing our prayers as non-specialists, as congregants, as the assembly at Mass? And in a sense, in many ways, many people were beginning from scratch. And you can understand the sense of opportunity, but perhaps the sense of panic that there might have been in the church in the 60s and 70s, saying, what on earth do we bring to the table? What congregational music is there, since we haven't really had any? And it was assumed that the older forms were redundant. That was a mistake. I think the Anglicans, for example, have been transforming chant from Latin into vernacular for 400 or 500 years. We could as well, and it's quite clear that that's happening, not just here, but in the United States. There's a new, less ideological approach to what tradition can bring to the table. So it's an exciting time. The music of the 60s and 70s sounds like the music of the 60s and 70s, and that's why it is dwindling away from common practice in the church. And it was an important period to go through, but perhaps we need something of more substance and more sustainability, to use that important word of these days. And it's music of tradition, perhaps, that can bring that sustainability to the church. It has been sustained for hundreds of years, and I mean, the plain song that we talk about, some of it is very complex. If you look at the Graduale Romanum, Liber Usualis, and so on, there's some very, very complicated chants there that only a trained scholar could sing. However, there is also a repertoire of very simple responses from deep in antiquity, going back hundreds of years, that can still be adapted and used in English and the vernacular as well as Latin, that comes from that tradition. Perhaps there's something about the Gregorian roots of Catholic music, and Catholic music sounds like Gregorian chant. The great filmmakers of the past in Hollywood knew that. That's why whenever they want to have a Catholic scene, you hear Gregorian chant or polyphony. It's deep in the DNA of the church. Perhaps we should acknowledge that and embrace it and see what we can do with it.
Yeah, because I mean, I think my experience growing up was, apart from maybe the Missa de Angelis, I didn't really hear any chants at all. But you've many of your pieces, secular or kind of explicitly religious, have chants at their core. So, I mean, where did you find those melodies? Because presumably it wasn't in your experience in the parish.
There was a little bit of experience in the parish. The older generations remembered the Missa de Angelis mainly from before the Second Vatican Council, and I do remember it being used for a long while. And although it's regarded as not one of the best plain song masses, there is a beauty, a simplicity, and a practicability about it. People could sing it. We were taught it as children. And learned it quickly. The older people in the parish, who were by no means musicians or specialists in any way, could sing it. So it's clear that Gregorian chant has a place at a fundamental level and can be delivered and used as a vehicle for profound prayer. And we were doing it in Latin then, but as we know, chant can be transformed into the vernacular, and I've heard so many beautiful English versions of chant. Sometimes those chants are adapted from their original sources, but in other cases they are made anew out of the tradition, so that it's music that sounds like something from the deep past, but it has been made up very recently, and I'm very encouraged by that. It's obviously part of the liturgical mission of many in the church to pursue that, and good luck to them.
So, while we're sort of thinking about our, in particular, your kind of formation in church music in particular, I wanted to ask: is there a piece that you remember that gave you a particular kind of religious, kind of Catholic experience?
Well, although I've pointed out that my musical beginnings began with these recorders being brought into the primary school, I do have musical memories which precede that from very young in my life. My mother and father used to take us to Edinburgh for holidays, to visit relatives, and it would take us to the St. Mary's Metropolitan Catholic Cathedral there. So this would be about 1965, and I remember hearing music there that I had never heard before, and I didn't know what it was. I hadn't started music, but I remember being almost struck dumb, even as a 5 or 6 year old, by what I heard. And I remember stopping, carrying on with my brother and sister, and standing as upright as a 5-year-old could, wondering what that sound was. And in the distance, in the altar area, I could hear this very ethereal sound. Didn't know what it was. I could see men and boys in robes and lots of incense. It was obvious that whatever music I was hearing was facilitating some kind of ritual. And those very early experiences have lived with me. So looking back in it, it would have been Gregorian chant, but also some polyphony, because the music at that time in the cathedral in Edinburgh and I've just forgotten his name, was organised by a wonderful musician who was Benjamin Britten's only composition student. And he went on to form the Edinburgh International Festival Chorus. And he, it was a high point of Catholic music in Edinburgh at that time. Arthur Oldham, his name is. That's what I was hearing. I was hearing Arthur Oldham, one of Benjamin Britten's pupils, conducting Renaissance music and chant. And it was years before I realised what it was, but it stuck with me as an indelible memory that had a huge impact on musical and indeed liturgical thinking in the years afterwards. So you ask about music, Palestrina motets maybe, and masses, Victoria, probably. I joined that choir as an undergraduate years later, and that's what they were singing.
So you then went through your kind of musical education was kind of full of what was in the air of at the time. How did that core of Gregorian Chant and Palestrina, how did you manage to kind of hold on to that through that kind of? I mean, you mentioned yesterday in your talk, going through all the kind of modern composing techniques, which in a sense were kind of putting themselves in opposition to that. Or would you disagree with that?
I agree to a certain point. I mean, Gregorian chant, it has to be said, is the DNA of the classical music tradition. The whole history of music in the second millennium grew out of its basis in chant. So the music of the first millennium, and we can trace its origins back to even before that, provided the launchpad for polyphony through its use in the church and the cathedrals of Europe in the Middle Ages. The outcome of that was polyphony. Organum, of course, was the beginning of polyphony, and those composers like Hildegard of Bingen that I mentioned yesterday, Leonin and Periton in Paris, led on to great early polyphonic figures like Machaut, who in turn led on to Josquin des Prés and Palestrina. And all these composers were using their deep engagement with Gregorian chant as the launchpad for the new forms of polyphony that they were creating. So right through that millennium, Gregorian chant was central to the development of music. Composers would have known their Liber Usualis or whatever other forms of the chant they had. There was interaction between chant and polyphony all through the liturgies of the early part of the millennium. And right through the Baroque, the Catholic Baroque in particular, there was still a discernible trace of the influence of chant, the use of chant, right through the time of Mozart and Haydn. And when you look at the likes of Bruckner writing his motets in the 19th century, you can hear the influence of that stile antico, the early pre-Baroque music based in chant. And on it went into the 20th century. One of the great Catholic composers of the 20th century, Olivier Messiaen, based a lot of his music, his organ music in particular, and orchestral music, on chant. It has been kept alive, perhaps through a smaller number of composers, but the chant has been alive. One of my great friends and mentors when I was younger, the English composer Peter Maxwell Davies, who was no friend of the Catholic Church. I have the scars to prove it. Nevertheless, in his cottage on Orkney, where he moved, and I saw this at his working desk, he had a copy of the Liber Usualis on one side and the Graduale Romanum on the other. And every day he delved into these books because he saw in this music a kind of perfect melody. He would use that phrase, there is no more perfect melody than this. It is an endless flow of a kind of divine melodic source. And if he, as that kind of modern agnostic come atheist, could see that, in our heritage, there's perhaps a message there for the rest of us that we need to get back and never lose the traditional connection with this. It's the music of the first millennium which produced and kick-started the music of the second millennium and is now alive and thriving in many ways in the third millennium. One little postscript to that, I mentioned the origins of Gregorian chant. I think people were chanting in ways that would be discernible as church chant, even from the early centuries of the church. And it's because, as a precursor to the Second Vatican Council perhaps, in the early days of the church, the early Christians must have asked themselves a similar question. How do we sing our prayers? We are a new organization, we are a new assembly, a new faith. It wasn't until those early centuries that new Christian hymns began to emerge. I think the Gloria from the Mass is one of the earliest hymns. And so what did the church do? They relied on their Jewish heritage. They relied on the singing of psalmody that many of them had learned from the synagogue and temple. And musicologists, Jewish musicologists in particular, in our time have traced connections between early Christian chant and the kind of chant that was being used in the synagogue and temple before Christ. And we know that when the singing of the Psalms is mentioned, the singing is mentioned generally throughout the scriptures, but we know that when Christ joined with his friends on the night that he was betrayed at that Seder meal, they would have been singing Psalms. In particular, at the Seder meal, there's about 3 Psalms, 115, 16, 17, that is used in part or in full. So they would have been singing the Psalms that would have been sung in Jewish heritage for centuries before that. And the musicologists have suggested that the sound of that Jewish psalmody influenced the sound of Christian chant in the early stages. So we have a tradition that dates not just back to the early church, but as musicologists have pointed out, the contours of Catholic chant are discernible in the contours of pre-Christian Jewish chant as well. So this is a very, very old connection that we've got in Christendom, and we should never lose it.
Thank you so much.
I think it's awesome to think of Jesus as singing as well. And so if
Jesus probably a great singer, wasn't he?
Yeah. Wonder whose teacher was. But you know, if Jesus was singing his prayers, then and according to Saint Augustine, those who sing pray twice. There's a lesson there for the rest of us. We know and we lament the fact that in many in the Catholic world don't sing or can't sing. And if it was good enough, or if it's good enough for Jesus, why can't the singing of our divine praises be good enough for us?
So, I mean, following on from that, I mean, I'm as a choral singer myself, and shout out to the Lewisham Choral Society and Dan Ludford Thomas, the director there. My main exposure, I would say, to the great religious repertoire has been in secular context, in concerts and masses and requiems sung with great skill and gusto, but with no real reference to their inspiration or content. I'd love to know your thoughts on whether that's really kind of sustainable, and also what effect do you find that it has on the way that those pieces of music are performed?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the secular world has kept that tradition alive, sometimes in very beautiful and spiritual ways. And there is a knowledge within the lovers of this music that the origins of our great musical tradition lie in Judeo-Christian civilization and indeed with the church. Pardon me. And I think that's probably why Music is such a meeting ground of people of different experiences, different worldviews. I spend a lot of my time with people who don't share my religion or worldview, but who love music. And the noise of the culture wars between the believer and the non-believer stops dead when it comes to music, because when people love music and are involved in the performances of the music you're talking about, that hostility between believer and non-believer, and especially from non-believer to the deep belief of the church, ceases or goes silent momentarily when there's a realization that this deep tradition is something that we indeed love. And that when they say and claim that music is the most spiritual of the arts, they mean something by that. But they are also cognizant of the fact that the music that they love, whether it be the Bach Passions or Handel's Messiah, Elgar's Dream of Gerontius, and so on, they're there because of the deep faith of their composers and the way that music served their communities and served their culture. And there's therefore a deep respect in the secular world for the religious roots of this music. And I celebrate that. I'm delighted about it. I wouldn't really be able to do what I do and get away with what I do in the secular world if there wasn't that respect and indeed affection from the non-believers to people like us, because of the heritage, the gift from history that we've brought to the table to serve them and to infuse their lives.
Because I do wonder sometimes whether it really is our sort of secret weapon in evangelization as well. Because sometimes, the choral director will be speaking to, these secular singers and sort of say, you have to sing, the Agnus Dei or something as if you really believe it. And, it changes the way that people sing it. And I often wonder, wouldn't it be great if that as if you believe it could just make that next move into really believing it?
Well, I think that evangelization is underway. It takes time and it moves at God's speed rather than man's speed. It moves slowly, inexorably through history and through culture. But I'm very aware that music is a form of revelation to the world, not just to believers, but that in their own way, non-believers and the skeptical in general are having their souls opened up by an art form which I think opens a window or a door onto the very nature of God itself. Perhaps it's music itself that is, rather than words or the usual understanding of what evangelization is. Maybe music itself is part of that reconversion of the world to an understanding of the love of God.
So more music, less words in evangelization. Would that be your recipe?
Well, I hesitate in the presence of great preachers to say anything more than that. But there is something about music that can sometimes startle and surprise a listener, the beholder, which Christians, the church, should be aware of. Music moves in mysterious ways, as God does.
I'd like to ask you about the sort of big set piece religious kind of repertoire, a lot of which you have contended with. If we could start maybe with the Passions. So how does one go about writing a passion after Bach, I suppose?
With great trepidation. I've written 2 passions so far. The plan was that I would work through all 4 of them. I don't know if that's going to happen, but so far I've written a St. John and a St. Luke. And to begin with, it was terrifying, as St. John came first, and I was aware of the ghost of J.S. Bach hovering above my shoulder. And I think every
Did he help?
Yes, I think so. But one had to try and put a lot of that music and experience out of one's mind. It's almost impossible to do that. And for me, I had to embrace it. In fact, I quote from Bach at various points in both pieces, almost as if it's an acknowledgement of the origins of it. But it hasn't stopped composers writing passions. I mean, there's actually more passion settings being composed now than ever before, and they're not all being composed by believers. Interestingly, there was a spate of them at the time of the millennium. It seemed to be a theme, and it was very interesting who rose to the challenge. The likes of Wolfgang Riem in Germany, as well as believers like Sofia Gubaidulina, the Russian composer who died recently. Osvaldo Gozhilov, the Argentinian Jewish composer, has written a St. Mark. There's the Little Matchstick Passion by John Adams. Again, there's sometimes a very anxious desire on the part of these composers to put a little bit of distance between them and the source, but nevertheless, they are engaging with the tradition in their own ways. For me, though, it was a full blood. Both the St. Luke and the St. John were full-blooded statements of faith, but they've been taken up by secular organisations. The St. John was commissioned by the London Symphony Orchestra, and the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And so with that piece and the St. Luke is performed, it's not performed as part of liturgy, wasn't written for liturgy, but those music lovers who love the Bach Passions and come to concert performances of the Bach Passions or the Messiah by Handel, they in a sense understand that it is a quasi-liturgical experience that they're encountering, and they come with a different kind of mindset or soul set. They're getting the full spiritual impact of Bach's evangelism, and it's a very interesting encounter between the sacred and the secular when these great works from the past are performed, and I felt part of that heritage. My St. John was performed recently in Dublin. I wasn't present at it, but I got some great reports about the performance conducted by David Hill. And I remember thinking when I was writing it, what do I do in this that is different from Bach, and what do I do that is similar to Bach? And I had to contend with that a lot. There's a lot of intertextuality in St. John. There's lots of moments where the text goes away from the St. John text and into Latin motet texts and so on. When I wrote my St. Luke, I decided just to stick to the St. Luke, and there's no intertextuality. So there are different ways of doing it, I suppose. And if I write a St. Mark, which would be the next one, I'd try and do something very different again. The Passion sessions are gradually getting smaller. St. John was massive. St. Luke was a little smaller. If the St. Mark arrives, it would probably just be for choir and organ and maybe soloists, and maybe if there's a St. Matthew, it would just be for 4 singers or something like that.
Oh, I look forward to that very much. What about the great, I don't know, I suppose the great kind of Everest that every composer ends up kind of trying to scale, which is the Requiem Mass. I often feel that of all the reforms of the liturgy, the changing the text of the Requiem Mass was, I think, the biggest own goal for the Catholic Church, in the sense that we've lost some of our greatest repertoire that can be used kind of in its original context. Yet I think it lives, those texts live on as, I would say, the kind of ultimate challenge for the Western composer. So I'd love to, I mean, you've written a concert requiem. I'd love to hear what your kind of favorite requiem is from the many thousands. There's a website that has listed all the requiems that have ever been composed, and that the numbers are just kind of increasing and increasing. I'd love to hear what your kind of favorite is, and how you approach that, and whether it's you'd ever maybe think about doing a kind of liturgical requiem.
Well, there's a lot there, actually. I mean, my favourite requiem is the Plainsong Requiem,
Okay.
which I've sung or been involved in singing at requiems of my own relatives and so on. There's something very beautiful about it. I love the Benjamin Britten War Requiem. It's a kind of hybrid piece, of course, with First World War poetry and so on, but it's it's a profound work which bridges between the sacred and the secular in a very effective way. As a kind of a cry against war, a cry for peace in our time, written in response to the Second World War. I like the Verdi Requiem very much, written by an agnostic famously, but obviously infused by not just his operatic heritage, but his Catholic background as well. Would I ever? Yes, I think I would like to work up to writing a liturgical requiem. I've written a number of concert works, and I want to get back to liturgy. I'm gearing up to write another Mass setting, which is not a requiem, but I deliberately want it to be used for liturgy. It's from an American organization. And if that works, and I'm writing it in different versions, so it could be done with a good amateur church choir, and that's the aim. So it's a bit of practicality involved in it. And there'll be a version for organ, there'll be a version for string quintet, a version for string orchestra. And if that works, the next stage would be a liturgical requiem. And the questions arise: what texts would I use, and what would I? Because there's a whole range of possibilities and choices to be made, depending on tradition, but also what the church wants and needs. As you say, I've written a concert requiem, which is a singular, almost symphonic requiem. I wrote it over 12 years ago now, or thereabouts. Its title is A European Requiem, and the first performance was at the Bach Oregon, the Bach Festival in Oregon, in the United States. And I got there the day after the Brexit referendum, and
A Requiem for Europe.
and well, that's what they thought it was. And so I kept on getting these mad questions about what do I think of Nigel Farage, and what's David Cameron going to do now? It's just, this music isn't about that. It's something much more profound, I thought, actually. But it's and I don't want to go to what it's really about, because it will just get me into more trouble, I suppose. But it is a through composed requiem, and I did remember making choices: do I include the Dies Irae or not? I think that there are moments where there are snatches of the Dies Irae are used, and I agree. It would be a great shame if the church had to drop texts like that for I don't know what reason.
So, I'd love to speak about just briefly before we come to an end about what I would say is one of the highlights of my life as a Catholic in Britain, which you were a great part, which was that moment of the opening mass, the opening of the mass in Westminster Cathedral, when Pope Benedict visited, and the procession begins from the sacristy, and all of a sudden all hell breaks loose with your tues pectoris, with where the brass was going nuts, the timpani. All of a sudden we were in the end times, and Peter was there. It was incredible. Many have compared it to Darth Vader walking out in the Star Wars. It was an amazing piece of music. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it was one of the happiest kind of moments, but also one of the most joyous commissions I've ever had. It came from Martin Baker, initially, who at the time was Director of Music at Westminster Cathedral. And there was a lot of debate at the time about what kind of liturgies would be suitable when the Pope came to the United Kingdom. And I was aware of the noises off about it. I didn't really want to get involved in it. There was I think there was even some argument about whether the choir of Westminster Cathedral should be involved in that Mass or not. It's just kind of crazy in a way. And it took the Pope's ambassador, I can't remember his name, that came over, the MC at the time, to persuade the liturgical powers that be that it would be mad for a papal mass at Westminster Cathedral not to have one of the greatest Catholic choirs in the world singing British Catholic music. So that's why the 4-part mass by William Byrd was written, a mass that was, I think there's somebody talking about it during this festival, about how that music was written for secret performances of secret usages of Mass during the penal times, during the persecution times of Elizabeth I. So not to have music like that used at such an important, profound moment for the Catholic community in the United Kingdom would have been a big mistake. So on the basis of that argument being won, I think Martin Baker then asked me if I would write a festal setting of the Tues Petrus and just throw everything at it, including the kitchen sink.
And boy, did you do it, yeah.
So yes, it's not just the choir, it's organ, big brass section and lots of percussion. Tam-tams and metal sheets and tubular bells and gongs and so on, timpani, bass drum. The Pope's face was interesting as he emerged in the procession, and I acknowledge it divided opinion. I'm delighted that you liked it. I think a lot of people did. Well, some people didn't, and the Darth Vader reference is interesting because some people thought that was a good thing. Some people didn't think it was a good thing. But I wanted to write something that was a celebration of the Petrine ministry. And was a source of joy in that. And some people would take the view that there was perhaps a triumphalist edge to that, and that was not
Excellent at all, the teeny bit.
Couldn't possibly comment. But I think that the desire to celebrate our church and its divine origins in that special relationship between Christ and Peter was compelling, certainly compelling for a 21st century Catholic composer.
And it was cosmic. And please continue to do what you do. I mean, we enjoy it so much, and it's great to have a fellow Catholic at the very top of the musical world in our country. And I really feel like this festival is one of those moments in which we can really celebrate what it means to be Catholic, and to be here to speak with you about really the joy and the beauty that the Catholic faith brings to our lives and to the whole country is something wonderful. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I echo that. Just walking around here yesterday when I arrived, I was just astonished to see the range of events and also the great sense of family, and the fact that the children are being totally involved in it, getting them to sing as well. And it's an amazing vision that has come to life, and I'd like to wish all power and fortune to those and continue it. I was immediately on the phone to one of my daughters who's got a young daughter herself, and says, you've got to come to this when it happens next year. So I think the word will get around, and they say that there were 2,000 people taking part yesterday. I've got a feeling it's going to be more next year.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Sir James MacMillan.